Hello, this is The Jay Show. This is Dr. Jay Smith with Dr. Andy Bannister. This is our second episode together.
It is. We survived the first one.
You changed your shirt?
I have. It's amazing what you can stuff in a suitcase.
That's great. Now, Andy, we want to continue on from last time. One of the things that we didn't get into is what you have done, where you've come from, a little background, biographical background. And we did ask you why you got interested in Islamic, and you did talk about that. But give us a little bit more background. What is it you have done? You've written a number of books, haven't you? You've also belonged to some institutions. Could you just kind of give us, so the crowd can know a little bit of who this Andy Bannister is?
Yeah, so I've got a sort of variegated career. I mean, I actually came out of computer science years ago. It was one of my first interests, messing around with computers, and then ended up doing youth work for a while, and actually then through Speaker's Corner. And what I encountered there, then sort of ended up sort of reorientating into theology and then into Islamic studies. I've written 2 books. One we're going to talk about, which
we're going to put up on the screen. So what's the first one?
So the first book I wrote, and this is the one we're going to probably talk about the most on this show, is called An Oral Formulaic Study of the Quran. Always good to have an impressive sounding title on the front because that sells books. And so that was my academic study of the Quran. And it was interesting, we'll come into this, but that computer science background that I'd sort of forgotten about actually became really, really useful during doing my PhD, because we did some computerized analysis of the Quran. We'll talk about that. And then about 2 years ago, my other interest, along with engaging Muslims, is philosophy and especially atheism, and as well as Islam being all over our newspapers.
So we'll show this very red-looking book.
It's a very red-looking book called The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, and it's an attempt really to combine comedy and philosophy. And really what I did is I was beginning to get quite annoyed with some of the kind of media-savvy atheists we see out there. People like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, whose arguments are terrible, but whose faces were everywhere. And I thought somebody needs to write a book to take these guys on a little bit of their own game. So it was an attempt to kind of use humour to sort of show just how much was really, really wrong with many of their arguments. And that was done really, really well. It sold well into 5 figures.
Yeah, and you and your family moved.
We have. So we were in listeners will tell by the accent, I'm a Londoner, actually born and raised across the river in South London. And then I was in Oxford. Then we moved in 2010 to Canada, and I was in Toronto for 6 years, and we came back last summer, and we now live up in Scotland. And I kind of wear 3 hats actually. As my academic hat, I'm an adjunct research fellow at a place called Melbourne School of Theology.
That's my alma mater.
Your alma mater down there in Australia, and
that's
practicing
terrible
accents. All of my accents are terrible.
All the Australians are cringing at that.
Yeah, they're writing in right now, but it'll keep their minds off losing at cricket, right? And so there's that. I also...
You're losing your audience, you know.
I am
Be careful
losing
of the jokes you give.
Well, I don't know where this goes. And people watching on the Indian subcontinent, great cricket fans out there. It's only you Americans who think that baseball is something. And then I also work a third of my time for an organisation called RZIM, or Ravi Zacharias International.
And that's what you were doing in Canada.
I was doing that in Canada, and that's really.
You were in charge, weren't you?
I was leading the Canadian outfit, and so that's really an
responsibility.
Yeah, and that's really an organisation that's just attempts to get the Christian faith out there into the public square.
Explain to the crowd, what do you mean when you say out there? What are some of the things you used to do?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of the time, sometimes Christians can sometimes be guilty of just sitting in our churches, not actually going out there and talking to and engaging with those who don't share our Christian faith. So I was out there on university campuses, in the media, business forums, politics, you name it. Anywhere where there are people who are thinkers, who are not really Christians, RZIM tries to get out there and engage them.
So these are public meetings?
Public meetings. We do a lot of things called open forums, for example. So we'll go onto university campus, we'll take a topic. Sometimes it can be a more confrontational one. You know, does God exist? Is the Bible reliable? Sometimes we'll take a sort of more open-ended one. So one of my favorite topics that I've done on a lot of universities around the world is, can life have meaning without God? And sometimes I'll do a talk, or sometimes I'll do a dialogue or a debate with an atheist. And we often get hundreds of people coming out and hearing those. Really to encourage you to think and think about this question as Jay and I proceed. The most important thing is whether the things you believe are true. If you're a Muslim watching this, you know, either Islam is true or it's false. It doesn't matter what your parents believe, what your culture believes, how you were raised. If Islam is true, you should believe it. If it's not true, and however much it may cost you personally, you should still abandon it and follow the truth. Let's be people who seek after truth. That's not always easy, but I think that's what God calls us to do.
Now, Andy, in the last episode, we introduced the idea that Islam is really dependent on 2 things.
Yes.
One book and one man.
The book and the man.
The book and the man. The book and the man, in this case, it would be the Quran.
Yes,
and
that's right.
Muhammad. And we're also dependent on 2 things. our book and our man. Now, because of that, we're very close to them. We understand them probably better than any other group. Christians can understand Muslims because we start from the same paradigm. You have decided to take on the book itself. And this is something that you did for your doctoral thesis.
That's right.
This is what you have in the book that you've just introduced. And this is what we now want to move over to. If every Muslim is dependent on these two things. Now remember, for Muslims, this is much more important than it is even for us as Christians, because though we have a book in the man, we also have a relationship with Jesus Christ, a personal relationship that Islam doesn't have.
That's correct.
So if you confront the book and their man, the Quran and Muhammad, you're confronting their whole foundation. Without that, their foundation crumbles.
Very much so. I mean, I think that's beautifully put, Jay. Two pillars, the book of the man, and those pillars are intertwined in one sense, because of course the Quran's authority and Muhammad's authority tied into each other. If it turns out that the Quran is not what is claimed for it, then of course Muhammad's integrity goes because he made certain claims for it. And on the other hand, of course, if Muhammad turns out not to be a prophet, if he turns out to be the kind of character for which there is question, whether your question is his existence or his character, then of course the Quran partly stands on the one who delivered it. So these two things go together. So I think Islam has always been very, very protective around both Muhammad and the Quran. Watch what happens. Look in the last few years, the cartoon controversy, when cartoonists have mocked Muhammad. What's happened?
The Danish cartoons.
The Danish cartoons. People got very, very upset. A few years ago when there's that gentleman in the States, in Florida threatened to burn the Quran. And got very, very upset. But I remember a Muslim friend once saying...
Or the Charlie Hebdo.
They're
in Paris, right here.
But a Muslim friend once made this point to me, and I never thought about it like this till my Muslim friend made this point. He said to me, almost in passing, he said, I don't care what you say about Allah, but you do not attack my Quran, you don't attack my Prophet. And I'm going home thinking, look, if God is God, surely you should be concerned about attacks on him. And I found myself thinking, no, it's the book and the man.
Let's back up. You're bringing up something very important. Why is it they don't really have a problem with attacking God?
I think for two reasons. One is God is so distant in one sense. Yeah. He's more of an abstract idea.
You know very little about him.
He's
never come to earth. There's no way that we can say that we have a relationship with
Allah. Well, it's
Allah.
more than that, Jay. He's never come to earth and revealed himself to us in the way that God has done in Jesus Christ.
So we have that.
We have that. Secondly, if you read the Quran, one of the things that struck me very early on as a Christian reader of the Quran is really just claiming to be God revealing his commands and his instructions.
Rules and regulations.
Now the Bible...
Don't do this, do this.
Yeah. Now the Bible contains some of those. Absolutely it does. But the Bible also contains God revealing his character and his identity. One of the stories for me par excellence in the Bible is that story in Exodus chapter 3. Moses, there in the wilderness, burning bush.
He's in front of the presence
of God.
With God.
And what does God reveal to him? Yes, he reveals an instruction. I want you to go and, take my people out of servitude to Pharaoh. But he also reveals his personal name, Yahweh. Turn to the Quran, and there are echoes of that story. That story does turn up, but in a very sort of cannibalized form. But that key moment where God reveals his very own name has gone. God's been pushed to a distance.
Missing.
So in a sense, I think for Islam, criticizing Allah, raising questions about Allah, it's sort of distant and remote. On the other hand, the Quran is...
Another example that we use this all the time. In Surah 2, Surah 7, Surah 20, you have the story of Adam and Eve in a garden that's out of earth. It's up in space somewhere. But is Allah in that garden?
Well, no, he's not, is he?
But he is in our biblical text.
He absolutely is, walking and talking.
Genesis 3, 8, and 9. He is there, walking and talking with Adam and Eve.
But it gets more interesting than that, though, because I remember the first time when I used to attend Speaker's Corner back in the 1990s, along with you and others. I remember that point that you would make and others really impressing on me, and I think it's absolutely right. And in 20 years of studying Islam, I completely agree with you. There was another piece to it that I didn't completely see back then, not because you didn't preach it. I'm sure you probably did. There's a matching bookend to this. The descriptions of paradise in the Quran, rivers of wine, crystal clear fountains of water, fruit trees, the houris, the virgins for the men. But what's missing in all those descriptions? It's the presence of God. Revelation 21, we have in the Bible, we have God walking and talking, going on. And so to go in the Bible, God is present in the beginning, he's present at the end, and in the middle of history, he's present in the person of Jesus Christ. In the Quran, missing at the beginning, missing at the end, missing in the middle. Which also leads to one other point for viewers who are maybe not Muslims or other faith backgrounds here. I often get asked this question, Andy, why can't you just affirm that all religions lead to God? And the answer I give to that is actually no religion leads to God. Only one relationship claims to lead to God, which is the gospel. But the Quran does not claim to lead you to God. Buddhism does not claim to lead you to God. The Hindu scriptures don't claim to lead you to God. It's only Christianity in and through Jesus Christ that even offers you the presence of God. And if you want to know the Creator, not just know about Him, there's only one offer on the table, and it's not the Quran.
Absolutely. I love to move one step further out. In Surah 7, Ayah 24, you have Allah then, basically, after they've sinned, He forgives them, but then He throws them out of the garden, down to earth. And I always ask my Muslim friend, okay, you're on earth, you're not up there. Why aren't you up there?
Because of what Adam and Eve did.
But wait a minute, you don't believe in original sin.
Exactly.
And you don't believe that we can take on the guilt of another. That's in Surah 6, Ayah 164, Surah 53, Ayah 38. Then what are you going to do with Surah 724?
Well, you know what?
See, you borrowed the story without understanding the most intrinsic
Here's the
meaning.
thing, Jay. I like to, you said you like to kick it up a gear. I like to kick up beyond your kicking it up a gear because it gets worse. The Quran is actually very clear. I think it might be in Surah 7 where Allah says to Adam and Eve, get out of here, get down from here.
That's verse 24.
To the earth, which will be a place of trial and testing for you. So earth is a prison camp. The reason we're here, this is not God's good creation, perfectly designed for His human creatures to flourish and enjoy, as in Genesis, where God looks at creation and says it's very good. It's a prison camp. But more than that, here's a problem. Imagine listening to this. Imagine you're a faithful Muslim. And you imagine that Islam is true. Let's just play Fantasy League for a moment. And you obey the commandments, you get to the day of judgment, and Allah smiles at you and says, come into paradise, my good and faithful servant. And it's wonderful. The rivers of wine, the fruit trees, the crystal fountains, the huris, if you're a man, great stuff. Then on day 3 in paradise, you do something stupid. You sin, you say a bad word, you do something you shouldn't. What's going to happen? Well, you're thinking, I can't sin in paradise. I'm afraid you can, because Adam, who was the first prophet, he sinned in paradise, right, and he got thrown out. So even in Islam, if you make paradise, how can you be sure you'll stay there? When I've raised this with Muslim friends, the ones who are more alert and thinking theologically will often say, well, same thing could happen to you, Andy. And I go, no, it couldn't. Because in Islam and Christianity, we have something that's not often talked about enough, Jay, in these conversations. We have the indwelling of God's Spirit, and transformation, sanctification is a theological term. The Bible tells us that when you become a Christian, God begins that process of remaking you into the image of Jesus Christ. And the Jay, the Andy that will walk and talk in the new heavens and the new earth will not be Jay 1.0 or Andy 1.0, you'll be 2.0. There will have been the upgrade. In Islam, there is no upgrade. There's no saviour. There's no forgiveness for sin, there's no transformation. And the problem of sin remains. It remains down here, and in Islam it remains up there as well.
Now, this is a good way to segue into what we're going to be talking about today, because we're talking about a story that is actually very similar to the biblical story.
That's right.
Yet it's missing some salient points. In the case of the biblical story, we know that Adam and Eve are on earth. We know that God comes down our direction and enters time and space and is walking and talking to Kuday on earth. So from the very beginning, our God has that relationship. But what's interesting is there are enough parts of that story that we can recognize. Oh, we know who Adama and Awa are, and there are many of these stories right through the Quran, aren't there? Quite a few of these stories.
There are.
We talked about in the last episode.
We did.
Unpack that a bit. Why are these stories there, and where do they come from?
Well,
and what have you noticed that's different? Because people have noticed this for 1,400 years. We've known, or 1,300 years, as we're now saying. But certainly you've brought something up that you started wanting to go into and that you wanted to delve into much more deeply.
Good questions.
With that.
Yeah, well, there's a whole range of questions packed into this. Let me begin by talking about what's there.
Yeah.
So roughly, scholars would say, roughly 20% of the text of the Quran contains what in scholarship we would call biblicist material. That story that's come from, and we'll talk about how it's come from, but it's come from the Bible.
Let's give some examples.
So, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Abraham and the sacrifice,
the story, Surah 21,
the story of Joseph, Surah 12,
Surah 12,
the story of
Solomon and Sheba, Surah 27,
the story of the Annunciation to Mary,
Surah 19,
exactly, and so on and so forth. The story of Jonah, for example, is referenced.
So all these stories,
they come from the.
We think they're biblical stories.
They're biblical
stories.
Use
the word biblicist.
So the reason we use the word,
you've noticed there's been some.
Yeah,
problems.
that's the reason why we use the word biblicist, not biblical, because there are some differences.
The difference there.
Yeah. So anyway, so biblicist means they have come from by some means, and we'll talk about that in a moment, from the Bible. Included in that, we would also.
I hope you're all following it. Not biblical, but biblicist.
And the reason being biblical is clearly, and again, I want to not preempt where we're going to go in a moment. Clearly what hasn't happened is Muhammad has not sat down with a copy of the Bible in front of him and gone, I like that story, I'm going to write it down. Because there are such differences that scholars are going, well, clearly whoever told these stories, if it's Muhammad or whoever, didn't actually have access to the Bible. But also, the other hugely important point, Jay, included in that label biblicist are stories that have come out of Judaism and Christianity, but are not biblical stories. So, for example, the story of Iblis and Adam occurs 7 times in the Quran. That's the story where Allah creates Adam, brings the angels in, says bow down. They all bow down apart from Iblis, who refuses, and he's cast out of heaven and becomes Satan.
Explain who Iblis is so people know what you're talking about.
Iblis in the Quran, it's interesting you say that. The Quran is not clear exactly who Iblis is. There is a debate in in Islamic scholarship as to whether Iblis was one of the jinn or was an angel. Because the argument for him being an angel is Allah calls the angels to come in and bow down, and Iblis comes with them. Those who think he's a jinn, it's because his refusal to bow, he turns to Allah and says, why should I bow to Adam?
Could not do this.
You made him out of clay, you made me out of fire. And the Quran seems to imply the jinn are made out of fire. Anyway, but Iblis goes on to become Satan. The fascinating thing about that story, that's a Jewish fairy tale. It's a Jewish myth. It's not there in the Old Testament. We know the Jewish community began telling it sometime around about 200 BC, something like that is when it first crops up.
So it predates the Quran.
And the rabbis knew it wasn't a biblical story. It was never claimed to be. It was the kind of story you told to, amuse the children, to entertain people. It was an entertaining story.
These are apocryphal writings.
Yeah, and we also have the same coming from the Bible. So we have the Christian tradition. So we have stories like Jesus bringing clay birds to life.
Blowing on them when they're flying to there. That's Surah 3, Ayah 49.
That comes from, or stories like the infant Jesus talking in the
Surah 3, Ayah
cradle.
46.
This is great. You're a walking concordance.
I'm just going to help you out on these because these are things that people might want to check you up on. They might say, hold on,
exactly.
Andy's just making
now
this
those
up.
stories.
Those are in the Quran.
Those stories come from things like the infancy gospel of Thomas, the infancy gospel of James. They date from the 200s, so 200
what
years.
are these infancy gospels?
So basically, what happens in Christianity, similar to Judaism, but once Christianity gets going, and we get into the 200s and 300s, Christians began, as well as passing on the scriptures and preaching the scriptures, began also telling sort of edifying stories. They're sermon illustrations, fairy tales, stories to entertain the children. And
so these are like bedtime stories in some ways.
Yes, I mean, exactly what they were used for, we're not entirely sure, but here's the interesting thing. I think you can mount a very strong case that the Christians who are using these, the Jews who are using these, they knew these weren't scripture. They
made a big difference between.
Let me give you a very good example why. One of my first bits of scholarship was looking at a document called the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy. Dates from the late 400s, early 500s, and it collects some of these earlier stories and retells them. Some people think it's influenced the Quran in a couple of places. Here's what's fascinating. When the author of the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy quotes those apocryphal books, he does so very loosely. He paraphrases. He doesn't bother quoting word for word. When he quotes the canonical Gospels, when he quotes the Bible, he is word for word the same. And scholars, I think, would say that's because he knows he's handling Scripture, and you handle Scripture differently. In the same way that if you told me a story about you and your kids that happened a few weeks ago, you're not going to worry about making sure it's exactly word for word. If you quote me a Bible verse, you will.
Let's back up a bit. We do know that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD.
That's correct.
And we do know that the Jews were thrown out of Jerusalem. Many of them went out into the diaspora.
Arabia.
So they went to Arabia, they went to a
places.
place like Ctesiphon, which is what today Baghdad.
So we had Jewish communities there, you're absolutely right.
But they took their scriptures, rolled up in scrolls, and they treasured them. But as they went out, we do know that they came across other stories. They came across other traditions.
That's right, we came across other traditions. Now, at the same time as well, that's interesting to think about Arabia for a moment. We know a couple of other quite interesting things about Arabia. There were also Christian groups there, particularly heterodox, unorthodox
and why were they there?
For very good reasons. If you picture a map, up to the north and the west of Arabia.
We can show a map right here. We'll put a map up here right now.
Isn't it amazing that technology you have?
That's it. It's terrific. I can only do this because I'm not the one that's going to do it. It's our men.
And what viewers at home may not know is Jay is actually 94 years old, but using digital technology. Look at this. We can make him look like an 80-year-old man.
If you believe that, you're not going to believe anything else he says.
So anyway, so up to the north and west of Arabia.
I am older than you, but not that old.
Up to the north and west of Arabia, you have the Byzantine Empire, Christian Empire. They took a pretty robust approach to heretics in that they persecuted them quite extensively.
And
threw them out. So a lot of those.
They throw them to?
Well, a lot of those groups went into Arabia.
So these Arabs are hearing these stories.
Yep. You also have, of course, over to the north and the east, you have the Zoroastrians, the Persians up there, so those stories are floating in, and you have sort of native Arabian religious groups as well. So what scholars will say is that the Arabia into which Muhammad is born in 570 AD, if the Muslim histories are to be believed, is a religiously pluralistic. It's a melting pot. In fact, we see that in Islamic histories. Think about the Kaaba.
Of all the people who've been thrown out, you might say, but they're
all there. And of course, in one sense, that's not controversial. Many Muslims may be aware, but if not, you can read the text there in the biographies. We read that when Muhammad was a young man, the Kaaba, that great cube-shaped building in Mecca towards which Muslims pray today, according to tradition, there in the Kaaba, how many idols were in the Kaaba?
365. But we're going to dispel this in another talk.
We are indeed. So let's not go there.
Do you know what he says according to what the traditions say?
Exactly. That's
now,
what
do you mean by that?
So what we're talking here is we're talking about what the things like the Hadith and the Sirah and those early Muslim sources tell us. We have a religious melting pot. But something
200 to 300 years later.
Something else is going on as well, though. Arabia is also an illiterate culture. Writing hasn't really taken place. Writing is beginning to develop, but largely it's an illiterate culture. So, for example, what is it that we know of in scholarship and in historical studies from before Islam? Well, Arabia, of course, is famous for the oral poetry of the Bedouins. It's an oral poetry. They didn't write it down. They didn't have access to writing. The Bible, for example.
There is an oral tradition that exists.
There is an oral tradition that exists. And also, we don't know, for example,
the suspended poems, the mu'allaqat.
Those kind of things.
Well known. These predate
Islam, and these are oral creations.
Well known at that time.
The Bible's not available, as far as we know, in scholarship in Arabic.
Why is that?
At the time, again, because you're dealing with an oral culture.
Okay, look, stop right there. Do we know when the Bible was finally translated into Arabic?
Remind me of the date. You're the walking encyclopedia.
Well, actually, no. We were just finding out now that the earliest biblical text, the earliest New Testament text, is the Codex Sinaiticus 151, which was found in Mount Sinai, where the Sinaiticus is found. They've just now found and looked at it, and they find they're dating this to 687.
So there you go.
So the late 7th century, long after Muhammad's death, we have the earliest text of the New Testament that has been translated into Arabic. I just want to put one other thing just for people to hear this. Do you know what the name of Jesus is in that?
I'm going to guess Isa.
Nope.
No.
Yeshua.
Yeshua. Interesting.
Stop and think.
Yes.
Why is it that the Christians were still using Yeshua as late as 687? Yet the Quran supposedly had Isa prior to that, in what we're talking about, a good 30 years earlier than that.
Interesting, eh?
Okay, well, that's not.
That's another thing.
We're going to do this in the manuscript evidence. But
now let's come back to this. So what you've got this great oral melting pot, oral culture before writing, ideas floating around. Now, what's very, very, very interesting? There's been an incredible amount of work done on how oral cultures operate. In fact, there's a whole school of scholarship known as oral traditional studies. Because one of the things that first intrigued me when I first began talking with Muslims in the late 1990s, I would have Muslim friends come to me and say, look, it's easy, right? The Quran is a miracle because Muhammad was illiterate. You know, the Quran claims he's illiterate. The Quran allegedly claims he's illiterate. The Muslim tradition allegedly claims that he does. And of course, Muslims who are a bit more well-read would say, Arabia is an oral culture. And here's this, beautiful work of literature. Aha! It must be a miracle. And when you first hear that argument, when I first heard that argument,
you'll get it all the time. In fact, we're still getting it.
There you go. I remember thinking, well, that actually sounds quite impressive. All of those steps line up. It sounds quite impressive. There is a glaring problem in that argument. It took me a couple of years to see, and it's this. We know of other oral cultures from which we have descended incredibly sophisticated works of literature. Most famously in the Western tradition, Homer, not the little yellow guy on The Simpsons, the Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two founding works of Western literature. He lived before writing, long before writing. How was he able to compose these great poems without access to being able to write? And the answer is we know that work has been done, and he did it in exactly the same way that I think the author of the Quran did it.
Okay, explain that.
I was waiting for you to,
I'm not going to. This is now. We're now really getting to the fruit, the nut, the kernel of what you really did get to. So let's unpack this. I hope you're all following this because this is really where Andy now has really. You've done this. Really, you're the first to do this. No, I don't think anybody else.
I don't think anybody has. No. So what happened? So let's just let's back up and talk about Homer for a minute or so.
Explain who Homer is.
So Homer, as I say, Homer was a Greek poet who lived long before writing was invented, and as I say, there were two very famous poems that Homer wrote: the Iliad and the Odyssey.
So this is long before Aristotle.
Long before Aristotle, those guys, exactly. In fact, the whole of really kind of Greek literature was based on. It was influenced by him, and in fact, of course, he's influenced Western.
Do we know his dates?
Culture and so forth. Sometime around about potentially the second millennium BC. Possibly even earlier. There's questions about his exact dates, but key thing is he exists before writing. Before writing has been invented. by analysing his works, a number of scholars discovered, and it's a fascinating feature, built into Homer's poems are these short repeated phrases that are used time and time again. In fact, the term we use for them in oral traditional studies is formulae. And the reason they're there is actually if you're an oral poet, and particularly if you're composing live in front of an audience, I mean, we're doing this live, but let's imagine there were 500 people in the room and you or I were speaking to them without notes. To be able to go at speaking speed, it's quite hard without a script or unless you've memorized it. And formulae allow you to compose your work at performance speed in front of an audience. Now, what was interesting, the first scholars to notice this feature in Homer then had the bright idea of going, let's go and see if we can find some living oral cultures to see if this actually works in reality. They did. They found this in Yugoslavia around the beginning of the 20th century. And two scholars called Albert Lord and Milman Parry went out and recorded thousands of hours of actual contemporary oral poets and found them doing the same thing. Formulae were what they used. And since their groundbreaking work in the beginning of the 20th century, we've studied something like 250 to 300 different oral cultures around the world and works that have originated from those cultures. And in almost every case, we found that formulaic language occurs time and time again.
This whole thing of studying the formula is something very new. So you're talking about the end of the last century.
Really, the end of the last 20th century when this began to be done.
So this is all new material.
Pretty new stuff. And what's interesting, as I say, is the number of cultures it's been used on.
Over 300.
Almost 300, in fact, over 300 now. Well, say when I began my PhD studies and I began being suspicious that the Quran had come out of this kind of milieu, this kind of background, the thought occurred to me, I wonder what would happen if you took this methodology and used it on the Quran. Now, formulaic analysis is very, very slow because you open a text up and you go through line by line.
Before we do that, because we do want to end this episode, and I don't want to really start something that's really going to be exciting. I want to leave it for the next episode.
Oh, okay, that's exciting.
So let's kind of review what we've done so far. This, to me, I'm starting to get salivate now because this is getting exciting. Not only because of the fact that this is new, but it also shows us something that about the Quran that takes it away from this book that is in heaven, this book that's on eternal tablets.
And it puts it into history.
Puts it in history, and it puts it into human history.
I think that's hugely important. In fact, a good friend of mine and a friend of yours, Dr. Keith Small, from Oxford. I mean, Keith has written a little bit. He's written several big academic books. In fact, we have one of them here. This one.
There we go.
He's written a little book called Holy Books Have a History, and it's a very clever title. Because I think sometimes Muslims can end up assuming, the Quran dropped directly from heaven. But to actually, the more you study it, and particularly study it using some of the methodology I'm talking about, you put it back into history. And I think that's hugely important because to understand a text, you need to understand where it came from. In fact, at the end of my book, I use an analogy from archaeology. If an archaeologist is digging in the ground and they bring a piece of pottery out of the ground, before they go off and clean it up and get all excited about it, they're going to record what's above it and what's below it in the ground so you can put that in its historical position because you can understand it better. And one of my problems with the Quran, Muslims, I think well-meaning to, because they believe what they've been told, have ripped the Quran out of history. And in so doing, something has been lost. And some contemporary scholarship, I think, has made them the same mistake. My argument is, put it back in history. It looks like an oral document. We'll go into more why in the next episode. And you do know that orality existed at that time. There were lots of oral traditions. There certainly this had not really been written down. We do know that before Muhammad, that you have oral culture, certainly in the Arabic world. Well, you have it in the Arabic world. You have, as I say, the oral Arabic poets before Muhammad. And then here's what gets very interesting, Jay. Immediately after Muhammad, we know that a lot of early Islam was spread and developed by oral preachers, the qusas. They turn up on the pages of the...
These are storytellers.
Storytellers. They turn up on the pages of the hadith and the biographies. And in fact, what's interesting is about 100 or 200 years after Muhammad, as Islam is becoming more of a literary culture, then there's an attempt by the authorities to clamp down on them, and you can find this in the historical
So you have
record.
orality before Muhammad, you have orality after Muhammad. We're going to then pick up the next episode. We're going to look at that, and we're going
to show how the Quran fits
right in. So you're putting it in history. You're also showing that this. But you're going to show us an awful lot of just how oral it is.
Very, very oral.
How many formulas are. That's going to be in the next subject.
And human fingerprints all over it is what we're going to show.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's been good to have you here. This is something that you've not heard before. This is new. It's going to disturb some of you Muslims because what Andy is doing, he's taking it away from this traditional view, this orthodox view, that the Quran is above criticism, that it has always existed. It's this uncreated tablet in heaven that was sent down piecemeal over a period of 22 years to this man named Muhammad. He's going to show you that actually it's much, much more sophisticated than that. It's much more intrinsic than that. It has very little to do with God, and it has everything to do with man. Well, this is Jay and Andy, the two paradox right here in London. Over and out.